All right, hi everyone. I'm just going to give you a few quick research paper tips and also an extra credit opportunity at the end of this video. So it won't be very long, but these are just some little tips that I think you might find helpful, and we'll go a little bit more in depth next week as far as like incorporating sources and the flow of the paper and fun stuff like that. So research paper, just as a reminder, is going to be between 1,200 and 1,500 words. You will need a works cited page for this. And I have to say, do not copy and paste the annotated bibliography and use it as your works cited page. I only need the citations. I've had students do that in the past. And I mentioned this in one of the Zooms, at least yesterday, I know, but if you do that, like if you copy and paste the annotated bibliography and that's what puts you on to 1,200 words, guess what? That's not going to count towards your 1,200 words because that annotation part of the annotated bibliography, that's not part of your research paper. I only need a works cited page. Next week in class, we're going to go over the works cited page in detail and exactly what I expect from that. The works cited page will need to be on its own page. Don't put it just at the very end of the paper. Works cited pages always have their own page. This is going to be due on Tuesday, April 27th, and I know that's a departure from the Friday that things are normally due, but that's just because of the way the end of the semester is going. And plus, two, I want to have enough time to grade it so that way you have the opportunity to revise. So let's say you mess something up and you want and you make like a 75 on your research paper. Well, I want you to have that opportunity to raise that to a B level paper. And so I want to give you enough time to do revisions. A rough draft will be due the week before. It does not have to be complete. As long as you have something, it will be fine. So if you only have a paragraph or two, it will be fine, but I will have a rough draft due the week before. So paper does need to be formatted in MLA. So just a few things that I'm seeing with your MLA formatting that I want you to pay attention to as you write your research paper. The date is day, month, year, and it's the last part of that header. Some of you are leaving off the page numbers. Some of you are not using the Times New Roman 12-point font, not double spacing, not indenting, and not using a title. All of those are little bitty pieces of MLA, and all of them have to come together for it to be a full MLA paper. And the big thing is the titles. A lot of you are not putting titles. Do try to be a little bit creative with your titles. Don't just title it the research paper. Now, I said with like the annotated bibliography and the rhetorical analysis, it was fine if you titled it that way. But this is an academic research paper. You don't need to title it the research paper. Your title needs to have something to do with the actual topic of your paper. Going back to like my Edgar Allan Poe example, you could just say my research paper on Edgar Allan Poe, but that's really not going to cut it. Try to incorporate just a little bit of creativity. So going into it, you could do something like Poe's Mysterious Death, exploring the death of Edgar Allan Poe, or how did Edgar Allan Poe die? You know, something that's going to grab the reader's attention and make them want to read it a little bit more. Just seeing my research paper on Edgar Allan Poe's kind of boring. So try to spice it up just a little bit. Experiment with the titles. And again, if you're not sure if the title is good, just shoot me an email and go, hey, I'm thinking about this title for my research paper. What do you think? I'll be glad to help you with that. But keep it appropriate. So a few years ago, I had a student on campus, not my dual enrollment class, but she was doing a paper on the importance of sex education, and she titled her paper Wrap It Before You Tap It. It was catchy. It piqued the reader's interest. Like everybody's like, what's your paper about? But it wasn't the most appropriate title for a research paper. So keep it clean. Keep it kind of in that academic realm, but you know, experiment with your titles a little bit with the creativity and see what you come up with. I covered this in Zoom, but I just want to repeat it. Keep it in that third person point of view if at all possible. That's academic writing is usually in the third person point of view. Avoid that in today's society. I can't emphasize that enough. It's not technically wrong, but it's become one of those phrases that has become overused and unnecessary as it's implied. You know, like if you're talking about something that's affecting the world, it's pretty much implied that it's in today's society. So please just don't do that. This is a new thing. Academic research papers, you really need to work on writing these in the active voice. Most academic journals, like if you decide to go on in your education and you ever write like a massive paper or whatnot, they're going to prefer the active voice. So what's active versus passive voice? Because students tend to slide into the passive voice a lot in their writing. With an active voice, the subject acts on the verb, but in the passive voice, the subject receives the verb's action. So active voice would be children love bubbles. Passive voice will be bubbles are loved by children. Active voice, the waiter took my order. Passive voice, my order was taken by the waiter. Active voice, the cat chased the mouse. Passive voice, the mouse was chased by the cat. So you can kind of see the difference between that active voice. It's, present tense verbs and whatnot versus past tense. And as I said, students tend to slide into that passive voice. It's not necessarily completely wrong if you use passive voice. It's not that I'm going to count off a bunch of points if you use passive voice, but I just want that to be kind of in the back of your mind to try to write your paper in the active voice if possible. Now, in the body paragraphs, in the Zoom, I emphasize the importance of at least having that scratch outline to help with the organization and flow of the paper. Another thing it can help is with making sure your paragraphs stay on topic. So I get this a lot. Students sometimes kind of switch topics within a paragraph, like they start off talking about, the literary importance of Edgar Allan Poe, but then they might throw a sentence or two in there about his death. And it's like, no, each paragraph kind of needs to stay on its own topic. It's better to have two short paragraphs than to have one long paragraph that covers multiple topics. Students somehow get it in their heads that in order for it to sound like an academic research paper, you need a ton of long sentences, you need a ton of long paragraphs, and that's not necessarily the case. Sometimes simple is best. One way you can organize these paragraphs is by making a claim about the topic for that paragraph, bringing in evidence from your source or from your own knowledge, because some of you do have a base knowledge of some of the topics that you're writing about, and then finishing with a strong point or statement. And so we're going to go over this in detail next week in our Zoom when it comes to incorporating sources, and I'm going to be giving lots of examples of body paragraphs in that. Make sure you have sentence variety. You don't want choppy paragraphs. They are hard to read. They can also make your paper sound too simple. It is important to mix it up, unlike this paragraph. I wrote it that way that on purpose. I get that a lot where I'll get paragraphs that are just like this string of really short, simple sentences that interrupts the flow of the paper and it makes it sound really choppy. You also don't want to have a paragraph that's just one long sentence, as the information would easily be lost and the reader might not be able to follow the information quite as well. And it also leads to a little bit of repetitiveness, so this should be avoided as much as possible if you don't want the flow of your paper to sound off and put off any potential reader, as would result in a lower grade for your paper, just like this sentence. I did that on purpose. That's a mouthful. Again, I get this a lot where students will write these super long sentences in their body paragraphs, or their entire paragraph will be just one long sentence. And I'm like, okay, you just wrote an entire paragraph that's one sentence. Again, that's something that needs to be avoided in these body paragraphs. And even in your introduction and conclusion, you need to have a sentence variety. Mix it up a little bit. And again, I'm going to be giving some really, really detailed examples of this in our Zoom. I have some constraints with the time of this software program. But one good thing that you can do is use a simple sentence to really emphasize a point. Like if there's one thing that you really, really want the audience to pay attention to, make it a super short, simple sentence, because it will draw the reader's eyes to it and make them pay attention to it. And as I said, we're going to go over like detailed examples of that when we're talking about incorporating sources and body paragraphs next week. And again, going with the flow of your paper is just making sure that your paper is logically organized. If you're doing a biography or a historical topic, chronological is best. You don't have to be fancy. Some people think, oh, it's great if I jump around and whatnot. No, with research papers, you really just want to keep them as simple as possible. This link that I'm actually posting in D2L as well, it's really great for transitions, like moving from one paragraph to the next or one topic to the next. And I'm going to post that in D2L for your for you to look at. And as we mentioned with the rhetorical analysis, you can use headers as you move from one topic to the next. It can also help with the flow of the paper if you're kind of suddenly shifting gears, like you want to cover multiple topics. within your paper, but you can't think of a way to logically transition from one to the other, don't rack your brain and try to make it work. Just use a header. That's a great way to use a transition. Another thing to watch out for is trying to sound smart. Again, this is what I've been talking about a lot, like using like super long sentences or fancy words or whatnot, because I'll just be honest, usually you wind up sounding dumb. I mean, that's just what happens. It's tempting to use the thesaurus feature to change a few words, and that is fine. You want to use strong verbs, like using sprinted instead of ran or whatnot. That's great. Just don't try to change all the words. For example, this is just an example sentence. It is easy to see that coping led to Poe's death. You could spice it up by saying it is easy to conclude that coping caused Poe's death. You kind of changed easy to see to easy to conclude. That's a little bit of a stronger word. That's great. But don't say one can visualize that coping initiated Poe's untimely demise. Just don't. I mean, students do that all the time thinking, oh, I'm going to sound smarter if I change all the words out and try to make it sound fancy. Sometimes the result can be unreadable, and I've had that happen before where a student literally changed every word but the proper nouns in the paper, and the result was something I honestly couldn't read. I had no idea what they were trying to say. There are well over 100,000 words in the English language. We don't have to use all of them. With a research paper, you have to think, okay, who's my audience going to be? It's going to be a general audience. The general audience usually reads on like a 7th grade level. But for an academic paper, you have to think, okay, it's probably going to be college students and professors who are reading this. So you can bump that up to a more college level vocabulary. But again, I find it best if you just try to keep it simple. Yes, use those big words, but don't change every word to a big word. It makes it very much unreadable. Formatting titles. This is something that a lot of you asked about in the reflection a few weeks ago. The general rule of thumb is longer works are in italics. So that's books, movies, documentaries, academic journals, newspapers, magazines, etc. If it's a long piece of work, then it's going to be put in italics. Shorter works are put in quotation marks, and those would be your article titles, like academic journal article titles. But the academic journal itself will be put in italics because it is a longer work. YouTube videos, unless they are a full movie or documentary, because sometimes you can find these full documentaries on YouTube. If it's a documentary, then you would go to italics. But I would say if it's shorter than 15 minutes, then it would be in quotation marks, 9 times out of 10. Book chapters, songs, poems, etc. So if it is a short work, quotation marks. You do have to format these titles in your citations. Some of you in the Writing to Learns over the past few weeks, you weren't formatting the titles. Like the Dave Price video is a really good example of that. There was no formatting of the titles, and I would say over half of them. It is a short video clip. You would put it in quotation marks. So if you're using a book, and this is just a little side note here, if you're using a book, the location, remember that chart that I gave you that says, you know, what each little element needs to be in a citation. Some of you mentioned that you're using books as a source. If you're using a book and you use a direct quote or a summary or a paraphrase from that book, the location would be the page numbers that you're using. And it can be a range. Or let's say you use a quote on page 5, but then you use another quote on page 105. You would write 5, 105. So you would need to indicate whatever location in that book that you're using. So these are just a few little tips. For your extra credit, there is a Dropbox that is titled Extra Credit. And the only directions are, if you've watched the video, you will know. So the directions are really, really simple. From this presentation, what are 3 things that either you found helpful, that you think you're going to use, or, sorry, I lost my train of thought for just a second, or that you just didn't know before? So 3 things that you either learned or that you found helpful from this video. And if you really didn't find anything helpful, if all of this was like, oh yeah, I already knew this, then just let me know. Hey, I think I'm really good when it comes to writing my research paper. Also, if you have any specific questions, feel free to ask. But if you do that, just list 3 things that you found helpful or useful, and just upload that to the Dropbox. You will get 25 extra points. Now, I can't do like a actual grade thing because the gradebook won't let me, but as long as you've turned it in, and I will write little notes and let you know, hey, I got this, The 25 points are yours, so thank you for watching.